two more life sentences for Lori Vallow Daybell today. Erica and I are going to take you inside the courtroom one final time for that sentencing hearing that happened in Maricopa County. Erica, another very emotional day. Fireworks, I would say.
Yeah, Andrea, it was so emotional. And I feel like I was talking with people in the newsroom here. I was inside the courtroom, of course, but it felt like more people spoke out here than we've heard ever before. And this really felt like a culmination of everything. And just to set the stage for people here, we are talking about Lori Vallow Daybell. She has already been convicted and sentenced to multiple life sentences in Idaho almost 2 years ago to the day. It was the end of July. 2 years later, she was, in Maricopa County. Here we are, sentenced again today to 2 life sentences for 2 different murder conspiracy cases. So all of the victims in her cases. In Idaho, we have her children, Tylee and JJ, her current husband, Chad Daybell's first wife, Tammy. She was convicted for her role in those murders. And then here today, she got life sentences for the shooting attempt at Brandon Boudreaux. He was in the courtroom. He's the lone surviving victim. And for conspiring to kill her former husband, Charles Vallow, who died back in 2019. So as you can imagine, Andrea, there are so many people who have been impacted by these crimes, essentially all across the country. And that came up in the courtroom today. So there were a lot of people there, a lot of people clamoring to get inside. People were waiting outside, since yesterday to get in. We had people technically camp out. They said they waited overnight just to get into the courtroom. And of course, we heard Lori Vallow Daybell speak for herself. And there were a lot of frustrated people when that was happening, I'll say.
And she's representing herself, so she's able to speak not only as part of the allocution, her, as the defendant, but also as her attorney, right? So she was, she had time in court today, and I think everybody who has been watching this, of course, as you said, we've been watching this for years, but it was, victim impact statements are intended to be the family, the people directly affected by these crimes. These were both of the crimes combined today, both of those Arizona charges. So that expanded the pool of people able to talk today. But also, as you said, everyone in this case is so connected. So while this wasn't directly about the people affected here by the crimes in Idaho, that certainly came up, which I think just made it exponentially more emotional.
Absolutely. And, we can get into this, Andrea, because it felt like Judge Justin Boreski, who has been the judge for both of Lori Vallow Daybell's criminal cases here in Arizona, right. It felt like he was really letting people say what they wanted, really letting them get it out, because this is really the last time any of these people have to face Lori Vallow Daybell in court again. We heard after this was over, a lot of people say, all right, we're done now. This is it. We're not saying her name anymore. This is it. But let's get right into the first impact statement, because we heard from someone who, has really suffered immensely from all these cases, and that's Lori's adult son, Colby Ryan. He is her only living child. Of course, she was convicted for killing her daughter, Tylee, and her son, JJ, who are Colby's siblings. And as I said, he just suffered immense loss. So take a listen to how he addressed his mom.
Now I'd like to address Lori Vallow. She claims to be Jesus's favorite. She claims to lead a spiritual life. And she claims that she loves everybody. And she also claims to have seen Jesus and visited with him. When did Jesus allow us to commit adultery? When did Jesus change the commandment of thou shalt not kill? When did Jesus allow us to steal money from our dead children? When did Jesus tell us to lie our way through life? It must be a very sad life to smile your way through all the pain you've caused. Rather than being able to acknowledge the pain that she has caused, she would rather say that Charles, Tylee, and JJ's death were a family tragedy and not her evil doing. And I will say this, if you want to see darkness, look at the murdering cult that claims God has commissioned their mission to kill my family and others. Quite frankly, I believe that Lori Vallow herself is the family tragedy.
Wow. Is the family tragedy. We should note that Colby Ryan was speaking virtually, as a couple of people did. He was not there in the courtroom in person, but was able to, give that victim impact statement virtually, which of course they're allowed to do under certain circumstances, and powerful indeed. And I thought one of the things that that he said also today was just about the lies. I mean, continuing, just how he was told that his stepfather had died as a heart attack, because, as a result of a heart attack, and only when he sort of forced his way into the house, or to the scene, that he learned that he had been shot and killed by Lori's brother, Alex Cox. I mean, difficult to imagine in that moment how just confused he must have been, and how distraught. And he talked a little bit about that, of believing his mom, and having faith that she was honest, and then only to find out that it was so much worse than he could have imagined. Incredibly
Absolutely.
powerful.
He described, walking people back through the case of Charles Vallow's death. Colby indicated that his mom said, your stepfather, Charles, he was a father figure to Colby. He was the one that was cheating on me. So Colby, he said he really harbored this, distrust for Charles. He said he kind of cut him off. And that's a regret he has to live with, because he came to realize, as all of these lies really started unraveling, was that he said it was like his mom was projecting. She was the one who was having the affair with Chad Daybell. And of course, that's the motivation laid out by Trina Kay, the prosecutor in that case, that Lori, conspired to kill her husband, Charles Vallow, so she could get his life insurance money and go be with Chad Daybell,
Right.
who I should mention too is also sentenced in the case in Idaho. He is on death row for his role in the murders of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy. So obviously a lot of people impacted still by all of the people here and all the co-conspirators in these cases. So yeah, Colby's words were really strong, even if he wasn't actually in the courtroom. And it's, always interesting to look at, our vantage point from the back of the courtroom. We could see the back of her head. You saw that on the stream right there. But it looked like she was just sitting there emotionless, to be honest, Andrea.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and she hasn't shown emotion. Even when he has, he's spoken before, and we've seen different family members, address her, and we haven't seen a lot other than when she's talking about herself. I mean, I think that's really the strongest emotion, is when she, gets defensive of her, being mistreated and things like that. And we'll get to what she had to say in court today, which was continuing that theme. But not surprising, because I don't think we've seen much of that throughout this trial. Almost, I think when she came in, she was smiling. I saw her kind of joke a little bit with her, or seem to, talk lightly with her. The people there at the table with her, the investigator, and another person appointed by the court to kind of help her through the process. But I didn't notice any somberness, or certainly no remorse in her face today, which is kind of matches what we've seen in all of the proceedings leading up to now.
Yeah, of course. And Colby, of course, was just the first impact statement in a series of people that really, I would say, let Lori Vallow Daybell have it. And next up, we heard from Larry Woodcock. This is Kay Woodcock's husband. Larry is JJ Vallow's grandfather, and he would be Charles Vallow's brother-in-law. And, he was also not there in the courtroom, but he has really, been the face of this. He and Kay, I would say, going trial to trial in Idaho, and really just, have visions of them standing outside of these courthouses saying, we have one more to go. We have another one to go. We're going to go to Arizona next. And they're finally, here at these moments. And it was really great to hear from Larry, I think, because he's been such a strong force in seeking justice for all of the victims in these cases. Of course,
Right.
Kay, his wife, was in the courtroom, Larry appearing virtually, and he had some really scathing words for Lori, who he actually wouldn't say by name at all. Take a listen.
Murderous. You are nothing. You're a murderer. You're a narcissist, psychopath, delusional murderer. I can't tell you the harm that you have caused to our family, but I will tell you this. I know where you're going to be till you die. You're going to be in an 8x6 cell. You're going to have a steel cot. You're going to have a 12x8 desk and a stainless steel toilet. You will have 23 hours a day in there. I hope you spend the rest of your life 23 hours a day regretting your choices, because that's all it was. Murderous. It was your choices. You made them. You and your your husband, if that's what you want to call him. Or what? You murdered Charles. The best thing that was ever in your life. Or you're delusional, narcissistic way. I will never speak your name again, murderers. You will never get anything out of me again in your life. You are nothing. You are nothing. You killed Tylee. Did you enjoy it? Look at me, Lori. Did you enjoy it? Did you dance around the fire? Like you sent the videos to Chad of you dancing around in your room for him? Did you enjoy it? And then the most precious thing, a 7-year-old, autistic, unbelievably God's present to Kay and I, to Todd. Look at Todd. Turn around and look at him, Lori, because that's the last time you're ever going to hear my name out of your mouth. Look at Todd. Have you said you're sorry? You wrapped JJ's hands in tape. You wrapped his arms in tape. You covered his eyes. And you buried him in 8 inches of ground. Murderess! May God have mercy on your soul, because that's the only thing in life. And don't count on God where you're going. You're nothing, murderess.
You can see and feel the emotion there. And it's interesting because these victim impact statements are intended to be, as we said, about the specific crimes. And you talked about the judge here, Judge Bresky. It did seem like he let these people that were impacted really say whatever they wanted to say, within reason, because he spoke really about JJ and Tylee, which, in the very specific nature of this victim impact statement wouldn't be related to these cases. However, I think that the judge seemed like he wanted kind of to give that time, because it wasn't as if they were making claims about something that she hasn't already been convicted on. So these aren't false claims or any kind of claim that's still outstanding or that might have to be in front of a jury later on. But it's unusual, and it's not often that families get that opportunity. But they certainly
No, not
used
at
it.
all. No. And, just the way Larry, and he's someone I've interviewed before. I know your team in Idaho has talked with him. He's, again, been really a voice for a lot of the victims here in these cases.
Right.
And just the way he was looking at the camera, looking into the courtroom. I know not present. It looked like he was home in Louisiana, but I felt it. People were crying in the courtroom as he was speaking. Not Lori, of course. She just sat at her table, but he really, it was really piercing, I think, what he said. Everyone was just sitting at attention and just listening to what he had to say. And he was followed up by his wife, Kay Woodcock, who also had some searing words for Lori Vallow Daybell. And something he mentioned, and it's something we'll get to later, but I do want to point it out right now, Andrea, is that he said, look at Todd. And they're referring to Todd, that's their son. That's actually JJ's biological father, and how this all unfolded here. So Kay and Larry are JJ's grandparents. Todd would be his father. This is the first time we've really heard from Todd in this sort of setting. And, we can talk about what he said in just a little bit. But JJ was adopted by Lori and Charles, and they essentially trusted their family to take care of them. And once Charles was out of the picture, that's when Lori moved to Idaho, and that's when this all happened. So we'll see in a little while that I understand that, of course, these cases were specific to the death of Charles Vallow and the shooting at Brandon Boudreaux. But as Kay had indicated, none of this would have happened had Charles not been out of the picture. He would have been a devoted father to these children. So it really does, I think, come full circle, and there is so much interconnectedness. But, let's get right over to what Kay had to say, because she kind of had a wave of emotions from sadness to anger to, everything in between. So take a listen to how she started.
I stand before you today to honor Charles, my big brother. This courtroom is where Charles finally receives the justice he fought for and never saw in life. Thank you for allowing me to speak. Charles was more than my brother. He was the backbone of our family. He was steady, loyal, and endlessly generous. He was the kind of man who showed up for everyone without ever asking for anything in return. When you walked into the room with Charles, you felt safe, you felt valued, and that's what makes this all so unbearable, because the very person who should have cherished him the most, his own wife, betrayed him in the cruelest, most calculated way imaginable. Charles was a protector by nature, the man who would give you the shirt off his back and then ask what else he could do to help. He loved fiercely, laughed easily, and built his life around the simple but powerful values of family, faith, and hard work. It feels right that this trial comes after those for JJ, Tylee, and Tammy, because he was a true Southern gentleman. I know he would have told us to take care of them first. Lori. First, let me say this. Charles is not your husband. I can't do that. You have to address the court. Okay. Sorry. Charles is not your husband. Your disgusting co-monster, Chad, is. The Miss Texas pageant, Wheel of Fortune, Extra on Modern Family, July 31st, 2023. What do they all have in common? They're all days that failed to make you famous or idolized. Infamous? Yes, but never famous, never idolized. You spent your entire life chasing cameras, applause, and validation like oxygen, but here you are, exposed, convicted, stripped of the lies you wrapped yourself in. All your interviews, all your attempts to manipulate, triangulate, and control the narrative, even the one released just last night, have failed. The world sees what I saw in 2019 when you abandoned Charles, Colby, Tylee, and JJ to chase that grotesque shadow of a man, Chad Daybell. You call yourself a mother, a wife, a woman of God. You are none of these things. You are a liar, a fraud, and a murderer.
Wanting to look right at Lori to address her, and the prosecutor there saying, no, you need to address the court, address the judge. Very interesting, because that was clearly what she wanted to do, a very strong message for Lori. What is she talking about, the words that are the release last night, or what she has said last night? What's she referencing there?
So she's referencing another interview that Lori Vallow Daybell gave to a local station here in Phoenix. And, we have put in a request to speak with Lori. I know a lot of people are critical about interviews being done with her. She's denied every time I've reached out. I haven't heard from her. We know the jail says no. Lori has to essentially request for you to get in. But in the interviews I've watched, she essentially, and we see this in the courtroom, because that's essentially what she does in court. Is she deflects, she places blame on others, and she says this is absolutely not her fault, that this was just a tragedy. So I feel like it's more of the same. And you can only imagine how difficult it is for these family members who, have to face her over and over and over again, for her to just say, nope, not me, nope, not me. And it's got to be so frustrating. But again, I feel like there's some moments of empowerment here, and you could hear that in Kay's statement.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, and that's what clearly, again, this was very controlled. I mean, she was angry, but also, very specific, very pointed, as I guess is probably the right word. And it seems like they've clearly put a lot of thought into it. And, she mentions we talked about all the overlap, but that's why they're able to speak, is that this is her brother. And so, again, yes, it's her brother but she also is grieving her grandson. And so, again, that just the magnitude of this case just keeps coming back. And we're reminded of that again and again, each time someone speaks, and you start to hear the layers and all of the ways that they've been impacted by the many crimes now that Lori Vallow Daybell has been convicted of. And so it's difficult to imagine, and we talk about that, it's difficult to put yourself in the shoes of any of these people having had to have gone through this for the last so many years. And you just hope that these moments are somewhat cathartic for them, and that they are finding some sort of healing and empowerment, as you said, in their statements. That's clearly what
Absolutely.
this is designed to do, and you hope that's happening.
Absolutely. And, Kay, it was hard to decide which sound we wanted to use for, our recap here tonight, because there was so many memorable moments, I would say, in the courtroom. Kay went on to really give it to Lori Vallow Daybell. She said, she talked a little bit more about her need for attention. She wanted to be on TV. She wanted to do, she wanted to have an audience. And she's like, well, now you have it, but it's not for the reasons you think. People are lined up. People are packing this courtroom to see you. She said, she called her a freak show at one point, said a murderous freak show. And they want to see, justice just, befall on her. So really some strong, harsh words from Kay Woodcock there. And that wasn't the only statement that she made, Andrea. I think, this moment, it wasn't something that I was expecting. And this was another one of those moments where people were just, really crying in the courtroom, because after Kay was done with her statement, she came up and she read a letter, and she, addressed it by saying, this is a letter from J.J. Vallow. It was written, from his perspective. He was 7 when he was killed. And it was just truly heartbreaking to hear her lay out what JJ's life could have been like, and ultimately the demise that he had at the hands of his mother. So take a listen.
I love my dad more than I can ever explain. Lori calls the next tragedy in my family too, the next domino to fall. There was one thing I had left, was my big sister Tylee. She murdered her too. She murdered her on September 8th of 2019, just 59 days after my dad was murdered. Days after she ripped my world apart and took me away from everyone and everything that made me feel safe and secure. Then on September 23rd, 2019, she murdered me. Lori took my dad away. She took away the best man, the protector of me and Tylee. I am dead because she killed him. He never would have let her hurt me, and I know he died protecting me. He took 6 years for me to be able to have a voice, to be here to say what the death of my dad did to me. I am not a domino that fell in her life. I am Joshua Jackson Vallow. I am the son of Charles Vallow. I should be 13 years old now, but I'm forever 7. The impact of my father's death was my murder. And Judge, it is 13 years today that JJ's adoption was finalized, and they moved him immediately right away to Hawaii. And I hope you remember that. I trusted you!
Wow. I've never seen this happen in court. This was very unique for me. And I've covered a lot of cases, but I've never seen a statement like that, where it was, clearly written by someone else on behalf of a victim who is no longer living. And I was surprised by it. To be quite frank, I was surprised it was allowed. I was surprised that the judge and the prosecutor were okay with it. But I think it goes back to what we said earlier, that I think it appeared that they didn't feel like there'd be any harm in it. in terms of judicially, the judicial process. And so it was very, very interesting and unique, and again, just heartbreaking, and just to hear her also break down there in that moment. Is that the moment where she got very emotional and like wanted to look at Lori again? Is that what happened?
Yes.
What
So, and I
happened
know
there
it's a bit difficult because I didn't, I don't know what the camera is seeing. I'm sitting in the courtroom,
Right.
and it sounded like Kay was wrapping up anyway. That was the end. And she, in this moment, did turn to Lori again. I know we saw that moment earlier in our show where she did that once and she had to be turned around. So she turned around and she said, "I trusted you." And again, Lori just sitting there, no reaction whatsoever. Kay obviously very emotional. And then she turned to go back to where she and some of the other victims were seated. And prosecutor Trina Kay was about to get up and seemed like maybe turn her back around again, but she just kind of had that moment, got it in there, and then moved away from Lori. And we heard from Kay after this was all over, and we can get to that, a little later, but she was just like, "I'm done now. We're done now." So I feel like that was really her just getting it all out, letting Lori see just how, disastrous she had been to all of their lives. And I agree with you, Andrea, the JJ letter took me by surprise, but I think it was incredibly effective if what Kay was going for was to really show the impact. And again, no one really argued with anything that she was saying. So it was truly, truly an emotional moment. And as we mentioned before, more of JJ's biological family was there, people that we haven't heard from before.
Right. And that is unique. And that, we've seen some of these, and we'll talk about some of the faces that we've seen come back into court today that we haven't seen for quite some time. But perhaps that also speaks to, what we're saying is that finality, that this is the last opportunity that they will have to see her, that this is perhaps that idea of closure, whatever that looks like, but just this is the last opportunity to do that. And so perhaps that's why so many wanted to be there. And it also is unique because we do have Brandon Boudreaux, who is a living victim. And of course, all of the people around him that have been impacted, which is another sort of branch, if you will. And we've talked a lot about it. You have to kind of draw out this map. It's almost, like a spider web when you look at all the different ways that people are interconnected in all of these different crimes that Lori Vallow Daybell is convicted of. And he is another kind of arm of that. And yet he also has all of his family that were there and people there that care about him and have watched him suffer since the shooting at him. Of course, again, he was not hit, he was not injured. But emotionally, we heard a lot about the impact that crime has had on him as well.
Absolutely. And just to give, our viewers, an inside, view of all of this, the victims who were speaking today, or for the most part, and their families, were seated in the jury box. So in the courtroom, we have Lori at her table, we have the prosecution at the table, we have the judge right in front of us, the gallery, and then the media is all the way in the back. But where the jury typically sits is where all the victims were sitting today. And it was almost like Charles Vallow's family was in the front, and then Brandon Boudreaux's family was right behind them. So, of course, as as we've been saying, we started with kind of the Charles Vallow vein of this case. And before we get to Brandon Boudreaux, I just want to go back to JJ's biological father, because he was one of the people who spoke after Kay. And one of the things that he said, Andrea, was he has been to prison. He knows what prison is like. And he still finds Lori's actions completely vile. And he talked a little bit, not so much about his own challenges, but we know that's why he ultimately did not have custody of JJ and why JJ was adopted by Charles and Lori. But he was another one who said, "I trusted you." So we hear it from Kay, we hear it from his biological father, who again was thinking that JJ would have a better life with this family. And that ultimately was just not the case. It led to his death because of his mother, Lori Vallow Daybell. But Brandon Boudreaux himself also talked about trust when he went up there. But before that, we heard from nearly all of his siblings and his parents, who I think really emphasized in a way that we haven't really heard before, just how impactful the shooting attempt at Brandon was on not only his family, but his young children and the rest of his family. He kind of went into hiding. He stayed with his siblings. He stayed with his parents. They all kind of pitched in to help with his kids. And they talk about this fear that he was living in. And I'm wondering what you made of, I know we heard from his brother. He spoke about having a local business here in Arizona and the Boudreaux name being, and things that I hadn't thought about in terms of a victim impact. But it sounds like they really were very thoughtful, which doesn't surprise me because Brandon has always been so thoughtful in court when we heard him testify, when we heard him being cross-examined. So it seems like it really runs in his family, which seems to show a lot of love and support. So it's hard to imagine how these people were just really dragged into this. So what was your impression on some of his extended family speaking out?
Well, I think it's a reminder to all of us. We cover these cases and we do hear directly from the people. And you think immediately about the most immediate impact, obviously, the person who's living in fear, or, we heard him talk about kind of worried and getting a private investigator to determine, is he at risk? Is there something else going to happen? So you certainly can put yourself in that position. But I think it's easy to forget, again, about how widespread this impact can be. And so, yes. And of course, he also is connected to Lori and to that family, and had to then grieve JJ and Tylee. And so there's this idea of, yes, I'm impacted, but I think it's also very easy for him to almost feel guilty, not only survivor's guilt, but also, we have a tendency, I guess, human nature is to kind of weigh the damages. And I think that probably is difficult as well, is to know that this is an impact and it's significant. But that doesn't, it's not to say that it's more significant than someone else's trauma or more significant than someone else's impact. And so I think that's also just a difficult, kind of a difficult place to be. But I thought that was very helpful, I think, also to just remind people of the vast, again, the damage caused for the immediate victims, but just all of the people in their immediate circle and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was a reminder, and I thought that was very wise.
Yeah, and it was, the word that comes to mind for me is totality. It's all of these things on top of one another. It's not, as you said, Andrea, one person's impact is greater than another. It's just you add it all together, and it just has a continued ripple effect. And I think that was really, emphasized when we heard from a lot of his extended family in court today, who made the trip to show up here. He, indicated that he told his family to be quiet for the past 6 years. Really, he didn't want to have this attention. He didn't want to say anything that could jeopardize the case. So I would imagine it was probably cathartic for a lot of his family members to finally get to say something about this and to really speak out, defend their brother, their loved one, their son, and it just tell the judge how impactful this was. And I think someone who really stood up in this moment is Brandon's wife, Jenny.
Yes.
And just to give a little bit of background, so how Brandon is connected to this is he is essentially Lori Vallow Daybell's ex-nephew-in-law. He was married to Lori Vallow Daybell's niece, Melanie. And she has come up throughout these cases. She has never been charged, but her name came up a few times today, and people saying, we think there should be more justice in this case. That remains to be an open case. She has been listed as a co-conspirator in the attempt on Brandon's life, along with Chad Daybell, who we know has not been charged here, and Alex Cox, Lori's brother, who died before charges were filed, although he's the one believed to be the trigger man in that case. So it's just really, really impactful. And his, divorce from Lori's niece, he said it during his trial was fueled by Lori, essentially. Lori and, this whole plot. And it was truly, I think remarkable to see his new wife. He's since remarried, and it seems like she's been truly supportive of him throughout this entire process, and talked about a lot about moments. And before we go hear from her, Andrea, I just want to, hear from you. What are your impressions about Melanie being mentioned, about Brandon's new wife being so supportive? How do you think that sits with everybody?
Well, I think the Melanie Boudreaux thing, I think, is going to be, I do think that is the one piece here that still looms. If there was anything in this case that I felt like there was, a tie left untied, or an end, a loose end still there, I think that would be the piece. And I really wish that we could understand more about why she hasn't been charged, what investigators know, how those decisions have been made by the prosecutor. And we know that they said this is still very much an open case. It could happen eventually. I don't think I don't know why it wouldn't have by now. I guess I don't have a strong sense that, me speaking personally, I don't have a strong sense that it will. But that is one of those pieces that it will still remain a huge question mark for me about her involvement and why she hasn't been charged. But to see this, I guess this, I think it's interesting to see that this is the new, this is moving forward. This is, building a new life, and yet still very much impacted herself, still very much impacted by all of this past and all of the history. And so, to see her stand behind him and to be a part of this process and to be right here in the middle of all the family, I think also, as you said, speaks to really just the support that this family has shown, because she also is living with this. There's no doubt that if you are married to someone who is in the middle of all of this, you too are living with it. And so that impact is clear. So it's nice to hear from her.
Absolutely. I think so too. And I thought she had some really, really strong words about the toll this has taken on the entire family, everyone involved in this case. And I thought she gave a really strong statement. So take a listen.
Brandon had countless sleepless nights. The fear became constant. I will never forget the night when Alex and another showed up at his family home searching for his children and Brandon. The fear I heard in Brandon's voice was like nothing I had ever heard. He believed that he and his children could be killed. This was his new reality. These crimes weren't just about money or power or twisted religious beliefs. They were also about destroying families, destroying lives. Lori and her co-conspirators tried to take away a father from his children. Brandon was deeply traumatized, and yet he continued to show up for his children, for truth and for justice, even on the first day of our honeymoon, which was meant to be joyful and sacred. I watched my new husband weep in a car after having to identify the remains of a boy he once loved and tried to protect. That boy was JJ, the cousin of Brandon's former wife, the son of the very woman who tried to orchestrate Brandon's murder. That weight, that moment is still and always will be heavy in our lives. He has survivor's guilt. He sometimes wondered why he survived and the others did not. He would say I would switch places with Charles, with JJ, with Tylee, and even Tammy so that they could live. This is the kind of person Brandon is. He would do anything for the people he loves.
I wasn't aware of that it was the day of their honeymoon, the first day that he had to identify JJ. That hit heavy for me. In hearing that it was rough. Just again, recognizing that, and it immediately went back to those moments in court where we heard him talking about, and what we learned, through the evidence was that he was there to he intended the very day that Charles was killed, he intended to try to, have some sort of intervention or try to figure out what was going on. I think he was worried about what was happening, obviously, with Lori. And so I guess those can't help but think about those what ifs. And, had he been able to reach Charles, or if they'd been able to meet sooner, it's so difficult because we know that from testimony in court that Alex and Lori had been, I think they knew that was coming, and it almost perhaps even sort of escalated or, accelerated their decision to complete that killing of Charles Vallow. And so I thought that was, just as a reminder, and it was really tough to hear that because, and to see him, of course, be so emotional in that response. I also think there's something to be said for somebody speaking on behalf of him. Even though he's sitting there, it's tough to talk about ourselves sometimes, and to share that and to hear other people who've watched it and be able to share about him, I thought was also really compelling.
Yeah, and of course, Andrea, in the courtroom, Brandon was probably the furthest away from us, so I was not able to see how emotional he was. I think it's totally understandable, but we could not see that. My eyes were trained on Jenny, who was so confident in what she was saying, and I think hearing from her in this way that I've not heard from her before. We know was in the courtroom every day with Brandon during the trial and sat right next to him and was doing the same today as these victim impact statements were being read. But when it was her turn to get up there, she really did not mince words. And I think her impact was, her statement was very, very strong. And once she wrapped up, she went back to where she was sitting, and she and Brandon, got together and shared a hug because he was up next. Just these moments in the courtroom of, little bits of support as you're just really bringing yourself to face this woman again one more time after all that she's put these people through from trial to trial to trial. So Brandon, of course, is up next, and I think he really laid out everything that happened to him and how it impacted his family in a way that we hadn't quite heard during the trial. He was very measured when he testified. I think he was very cool, calm, collected when Lori Vallow Daybell was cross-examining him. And we can talk about this a little later, but I actually sat down with Brandon earlier this week to just talk about how challenging this has been to navigate with his young children. He's still co-parenting with Melanie Pulowski. So it is, there are some added challenges here. And to hear him really, a lot of our conversation earlier this week was forward focused, how he's been moving forward, but to really hear him relive some of that trauma today and just share how impactful it was on his children and his life, I think it, totally landed with the judge. And the judge even had some statements and remarks for Brandon afterward. But let's get to Brandon's statement so we can hear more of what he has to say. And it really just landed, Andrea. It's certainly hard to hear.
But I have never seen any remorse or acknowledgement from Lori or any of her conspirators. Only denial, shaming, and accusation. I would never feel safe if she has freedom. I will always fear her for what she would try to do again to hurt my family. The trauma of this attack has already shaken my children's sense of safety. It's forced me to fight through pain, and it's forced me to work to restore trust for them in this life that we live. Lori's conspiracy was an assault on the essence of familia or selfless love. It's an assault on trust, and it's an assault on the divine sanctity of what a family is and what I grew up in.
And that idea, and as you said earlier, when just right before he was talking, and you talked about how he's co-parenting, I have these flashes of you let your children go with someone that is, we have heard, is a co-conspirator here. And that, to talk about that broken trust and that safety and taking away what you believe or want to believe about what family is, and that just that safe space being no longer safe at all. That's, that is also, as it sinks in and you start to think about what that must be like every single day for his children, not only for himself, but especially for his children. I think that's really difficult to comprehend.
Absolutely. And, Brandon, was the last to give a victim impact statement. We then heard from the prosecutor on both of these cases, Trina Kay, laying out more impact. She brought in Charles Vallow's sons from another marriage who, the impact Lori had on them, who shared via text message that their dad had died. She lied about why they were not in the courtroom. And, I don't know what their connection is like to the investigators here, if they had been involved in the case, but it's, the ripple effect continues to widen. That's something that the judge also pointed out. But before, after these statements were read, after hearing person after person just describe how horrifying Lori Vallow Daybell had been in their lives, how, traumatic their lives have been because of her actions, because of, the killings and the orchestrated killings. And, she just sat there and listened to person after person describe her as, narcissistic, murderous, just all these horrible things. And then she went on to address the court herself. And it's almost as if she never heard any words that people were saying to her today, Andrea. And what did you think of how this all started? She kind of really, was blaming the criminal justice system. She said she didn't think it was fair. We heard some interjections from Judge Boreski. At one point she said, I thought this was about sharing, I thought court was about sharing both sides of the story, and I didn't get the chance to do that. And Judge Boreski was like, well, actually it is, you're representing yourself and you're not doing a good job at it. So you're not, it clearly didn't work for you. But he continued to interject even during, her statements here today, her final statements in the courtroom. So what did you make of how that started before we play a little bit more of what she said?
Well, I just think it goes right back to, I guess, of course she did. And that's my, my reaction is, of course, and I think that is what we have heard. We've talked about that at the opening statements, the closing statements. The reality is at every point that she's able to, she tries to make a point of her saying that she is, even as far as going as far as saying she's chosen, she's, she's special, she's different, she is, in the eyes of the Lord. At each turn, she's been the victim. She's been the victim of the judicial system. She's been the victim of the process of the judges. She's been mistreated. Now it's the prisons are mistreating her. And, we heard that when she wasn't well and she said she didn't feel well and how she wasn't being treated well in jail. So, I think, I guess to me, it's just par for the course. And I don't know that we probably should have expected anything other than for this to be one more self-centered, statement to the court but to all these families. And I'm interested in your, and after she talks or we hear that, I'm interested in how people responded to that, because that I think would probably have been the most challenging for Kay. And for the people sitting in that gallery to hear, it's one thing to hear nothing. It's something very different to hear somebody, like you said, almost ignore everything that had just been said, knowing that how it impacted everyone else in the room and to see how it seemed to not impact her.
Absolutely. And, I tried to get a good glimpse of the victims listening, to what she was saying. And, it's just kind of like, okay, just let it happen. You're kind of just like, This is it. We don't have to hear from her again. She's going to just say her speech or, what she wants to say her piece. But no one is buying anything that she's putting down. And, I watched, I kept a close eye on Judge Boreski as she's talking, because we know he has been obviously frustrated with how she's conducted herself in the courtroom. She's been combative. She tried to get him kicked off the case. So really, as you said, Andrea, she has this victim mentality about her. And that became clear as she continued to speak today at length, I think longer than anyone I'm sure would have wanted her to go sitting in the courtroom. But she really, I don't think we expected this. And as her uncle, who was in the courtroom, Rex Connor, someone who we've spoken to before, he spoke to us afterwards. He said, low expectations. He has low expectations for Lori. And I think everyone really does. And I don't think anyone was expecting her to own up to anything. I don't think anyone was expecting her to take responsibility or to show any sign of remorse. So take a listen to what she said next.
So here we are. The state of Arizona has accomplished its intention. 1, to extradite me from Idaho. 2, to convict me. And 3, to add to my ledger of lifetimes. The state used countless taxpayers' money to transport me, house me, millions of dollars to wrongly convict me on 2 charges that they made sure judicially that I could not defend myself against. I know political aspirations, raises, and job promotions were at stake. So congratulations. I was convicted in the media long before I went to trial. We all know that there is no way for me to come to Arizona and get a fair, impartial, or speedy trial. And now that fact has been proven. The state of Arizona brought me here when I was already serving 5 life sentences. Now I will serve 7 life sentences. Will that be enough? Will that be enough? I want everyone to know that I mourn with all of you. I am sorry for your pain. Losing those close to you is painful, and I acknowledge all of the pain, and I do empathize. I feel it too. If I was accountable for these crimes, I would acknowledge it, and I would let you know how sorry I was.
she's talking about feeling the pain. I mean, these are her children. So let's, take it for just 2 seconds that's her then belief is that someone else, right, that killed them. But even then she argues that they were zombies and that had to happen. And I mean, her story, you cannot follow. It does not make sense. But
No.
yet she doesn't show emotion. She talks about feeling the pain, but you don't see her respond to that. And the thought that she's going to just, again, go back to what this was unfair, you wasted your time. I mean, remember that Idaho initially was going to seek the death penalty against her. And again, her husband was convicted and does have a death sentence. So this idea that, is that enough? Well, they chose not to seek the death penalty, but that certainly was on the table initially. So I don't even know what the point she's making. Is she trying to say you shouldn't have come here? We shouldn't have come here. It's a waste of time. I never, how many
I don't know.
times we did this show?
know.
We've done the show for a lot. And every time I would say,
Yeah.
what is she going for here? What was the point?
No, sometimes there's no logic to what she says.
Yeah.
And what was interesting, some moments in the courtroom as she's saying that is when she said 7 life sentences, is that enough? People sitting directly in front of me in the gallery, some were saying, no, that's not enough. Because I think people, just the way she's able to just, sit there after all she's done and hearing those impact statements and just kind of flounce around and, make these claims that, the judge said you're not giving correct statistics. And, you talked about having no feeling. It doesn't appear that she has feelings. She's talking about her children. She did speak about her victims in, toward the end of her statement. We heard some of those religious beliefs that are at the core of these cases. And she mentioned that JJ, Tylee, Charles, Tammy, she called them out. And she said they are, peacefully in heaven and no one is seeking justice there. Everyone is fine. So just really disturbing, especially when you hear about the people who have lost Tylee, JJ, Charles, and Tammy as loved ones.
Almost as if this was a good thing. She almost is saying, she always continues to argue that they're great. They're doing fine. They're happy. Almost as if this was, like I said, it's almost like she's arguing that this was the better way. Right.
Which is not a logical argument and obviously not, not in reality. And of course, what she had to say did not land well with Judge Boreski, who I was expecting to have some words for her. And of course, we heard how he felt all of this transpired. And I thought he had a really powerful message before ultimately handing out those life sentences for her. So take a listen.
I've seen many, many cases in my career where someone faces a long prison sentence for what amounted to one split-second bad decision. You are not that person. The amount of contemplation, calculation, planning, manipulation that went into these crimes is unparalleled in my career. Your powers of manipulation are profoundly destructive, one that undermines trust, distorts truth, and can erode the very foundations of healthy relationships and society. The impact of your manipulation has been devastating, insidious, and far-reaching, and perhaps still unknown. One can't help but wonder if Alex died as a result of the extraordinary burdens that you placed upon him. No one will ever know. You preyed on the vulnerability of those around you, JJ, Tylee, Alex, Melanie, others. And today I heard about Colby. You specialized in exploiting the empathy and goodwill of others, turning those virtues into tools of control and harm. I think that over time, as a result of being subjected to your manipulation, those people lost their sense of self and their ability to distinguish truth from falsehood. In the face of such profound damage, a long prison sentence is not merely a punishment. It is a necessary affirmation that our society values justice, protection, and the sanctity of human life. You just referenced a Bible verse or a verse recently about the prisoners shall go free. That is not a literal verse. That is a verse about people that accept Jesus can be in prison and they will go free when they die and go to heaven. But it will take an act of God for you to go free. In short, you should never be released from prison. Eventually, the camera that you seek out so much, the media requests, will lessen over time and you'll fade into obscurity.
He was so calm and so collected during this whole trial, and he continued to be here today. But so I was very happy to hear just a glimpse of what he has seen and what he has believed he has seen in front of him, which is, the manipulation and really her, being this mastermind who took advantage of, exploited, misused, misguided, and all of these people in her path. And that's something I think that any of us watching these trials have thought. And so I was pleased to hear him say that, and especially interested in hearing him talk about Alex, because while he has it's been able to sort of villainize Alex Cox as the person who has committed these crimes, and I don't take anything away from that, but just to hear him say, perhaps was he also a victim of you,
Manipulated.
and right, exactly, manipulated by you, and was he carrying this burden? Did that play a part in his early death? That's fascinating to hear, and I was. I have been so impressed by Judge Boreski throughout this entire time, and that didn't change today.
Yeah, he's certainly been patient through this process, and I'm sure, this finality takes a toll on not just the victims in this case, but his staff, him, I'm sure. We know there were a couple jurors from her case in Idaho, from her cases here in Arizona in the courtroom today, and I want to make sure we're touching on who else was in the courtroom, because we had some investigators from Idaho who have been on this for a while. We had some investigators from the Chandler Police Department here in Phoenix who were sitting in the courtroom today. And what was really interesting, Andrea, and before we wrap up here for the night, is that when we were waiting outside the courtroom before we went in, this is the first time I've heard anyone ask this, but one of the court security members said, "Is there anyone here for Lori?" And 3 people went to the door. One of them was Lori's sister, Summer Shiflett. I did not know who the other 2 women were. It was no one I recognized. It was not her mother, who we've seen at one point in time in a pretrial hearing. So we know they're local here in Arizona, but her sister was here. She sat on her side. We did not get to talk with Summer, but we spoke again with Lori and Summer and Alex's uncle afterward, and he said he thought this maybe would have been a step toward healing for Summer. So maybe that's why she was there today. So truly, just remarkable how much of a toll this has had on so many different families, and including Lori's. There's, we heard her brother, Adam Cox, not Alex, Adam, testify against her in this case. It totally strained his relationship with his family. So the ripple effect just continues on and on and on here. But what I think we heard after court from some of the people who gave the statements today, including Kay and Brandon, is that it's time to move on now. From here, Lori Vallow Daybell will be extradited back to Idaho so she can serve her life sentence there. The judge issued life sentences today. Those are consecutive. I think that was just to send a message. Obviously, she can't have multiple life sentences and actually serve them, but that's the plan. She's going to be extradited to Idaho. We do not know the exact timeline on that, but this is really it here in Arizona, and really it for Lori Vallow Daybell.
Right, coming to a conclusion, a years long process, investigation, and then of course the judicial process. And so hopefully, like you said earlier, the best you can hope for is that there's now a chance for some healing and a chance to move forward with that hope that these young children are still Brandon's family, his children, of course Kay and Larry, all of the people that we have watched throughout the years. Hopefully that this is some finality and that allows them to breathe just a little bit easier tomorrow. So we have taken you inside the courtroom. Erica, thanks so much for being here with me throughout both of these trials from Arizona. It's been fun being inside the courtroom with you. We're so glad you've joined us here inside the courtroom as we finally wrap up the Lori Vallow Daybell trial. Now, she will serve 7 consecutive life sentences in an Idaho prison, where she will spend the rest of her natural life.